Hello everyone and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Implementing and Maintaining a DevSecOps Approach in the Cloud, Tips, Tricks, Operational and Security Best Practices, sponsored by Sumo Logic. My name is Carol, author of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are George Gerchow, Sumo Logic's VP of Security and Compliance, and Mark Bloom, Director of Product Marketing, Compliance, and Security at Sumo Logic. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We will be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Carol. So George, DevSecOps seems to be like a buzzword that everyone is using these days. We hear everybody talking about it. It's a little maybe overused. So what does DevSecOps really mean, and how should people think about it as you look at moving workloads into the cloud?
I think that's a great starting point, so let's start cutting some of the FUD out of it right now. I mean, it's really about baking security in from day one, so whenever, and by the way, this doesn't mean that you have to be a company that's from the West Coast and organically built in AWS like we were. It just means that when you're starting to put new workloads in the cloud or have these greenfield opportunities identified, start changing your habits and your behavior to incorporate security in from the very beginning. I think in the past what we used to do is we used to have like a hard shell, soft center type approach to security. And in the cloud, there is no hard shell, right? I mean, it's just all out there. And then we don't run as many internal applications anymore as organizations, and especially, like companies like ours in Silicon Valley. So, before when things were like internal mobile applications and Exchange, and VPN type solutions, and now we're leveraging Google Apps and 365. These SaaS-based applications, they get engineered completely differently than traditional apps when it comes from a security perspective. They get put out in a hostile environment from day one. When you think about the incubation of traditional old school applications on-prem, they were put into an environment that was already, quote, quote, secure, to where now, like I said, we're releasing these things out into the wild, into a hostile environment, so you got to be secure from day one. And another thing I'd like to say around this too is that your developers and your engineers, you have to have people who think security first when they're developing code. I mean, that is probably the most important takeaway. And there's some things that we'll talk about throughout this webinar on how you can start helping change that behavior or start building that DNA into them right away.
That is a great start. So when we talk about, baking security in or thinking about it, doing it early on, bringing it into the developer mindset, I mean, are we talking about like leveraging APIs? Are we talking about, spinning up IDS and file integrity monitoring and automatically as the images come up? I mean, what does it really mean when you say baking security in?
Yeah, and those are, I mean, so those are all really great points you brought up, but those are more about like how things that you want to look at to have visibility into the platform and sort of monitor some of the things that they're doing and administrators are doing, which is great. But I'm talking about like code review, like in short sprints, and setting up feature flags that will check code in a piece at a time, and there's no full release until it's done. So it's a mindset of feeding the code to break it, and then also getting developers to do security training, and whether it's outside with an organization like SANS, or whether it's internal where you're continually having these conversations and making it a top priority, it's really those short chunks and having it top of mind all the time.
Awesome. That was great perspective. So Sumo Logic is a cloud-native service, been running in AWS for 7 years. So why did you decide to build your service in the cloud? Can you describe a bit about the journey, what it was like, and kind of like what obstacles did you face along the way, and how did you overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark, the obstacles never, ever stop. I mean, they just continue to go. But I think the biggest thing was, the company took a look, across what was taking place, when it came to logging analytics and security analytics, and said, let's leverage the cloud from day one just for scalability, resiliency, flexibility, the ease of use to be able to collect data. the idea of multi-tenancy to be able to upgrade all kinds of customers at once, and then security, like right off the bat, security. Let's start leveraging things like elastic load balancers and security groups to really be able to lock down our environment, from day one, and leverage these great things that AWS has done out there and provides to a lot of their customers. So we utilize the AWS security mechanisms right from the very beginning, so like I mentioned before, security groups, ELBs, for the principle of least privilege. So I think it was starting very, very simple like that. And then, once you start simple like that and you start setting up, your load balancers to be able to leverage things like Chef to be able to manage machine patching, it gets easier, and then that way you can start automating a lot of things from the very beginning. So I think it's that idea of what you have here, which is starting very simple, leveraging some of the things that the CSP provider is giving you, and then starting to look for the gaps, like you mentioned SIM before and IDS, which we can dive deeper into. But that's really at the core of it, So the challenge originally was, okay, it's a whole new world out there. How do we do this? And then once we started doing it, the bigger challenge actually became getting people to buy off on the fact that cloud was more secure. And you remember this, right? I mean, you and I used to talk a couple of years ago, like people just weren't there yet. And in fact, a lot of people aren't there yet now, but most people just were not there yet.
Well, it's definitely a fundamental shift in thinking where security was always an afterthought, and now you're talking about, I mean, it's not just about all the different technologies like IDS, file integrity monitoring, vulnerability assessments that you're doing, but it's really bringing in security, as you said, to the developer, thinking about it early on as you start building and moving out those applications from dev to, production environments.
Yeah, it really is. It's as they're starting to build that code, so as they're checking in code, it needs to be ruthlessly inspected at that time for security, things like clear text passwords and credentials being in it, which we're going to talk about a whole lot, but it has to be ruthlessly inspected and then in those small chunks. And then, like the other thing, like I said, the mindset of feeding code to break it is the biggest thing that we do, and most companies that are in a position like us are doing the same thing. And then now what you're starting to see is traditional type enterprise companies starting to pick up on these same methodologies with the opportunity of a DevSecOps and DevOps supply, a continuous supply delivery chain. So as you're leveraging these new tools and these new techniques, start changing the way that you release things. These old waterfall type releases where there's like these massive amounts of code that people try to line by line. I mean, Mark, you and I both know that doesn't work. I mean, human error, software, all those things are going to ultimately fail if you try to boil the ocean when it comes to that.
Well, when I'm dating myself here, but when I graduated college in the late 80s, I mean, I was a programmer for a large insurance company. Our release cycles took 18 months. I mean, these were big mainframe systems. We'd sit down with the users. What do you want to build? We'd build a prototype. We'd roll it out, through these multiple different stages. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, no business is going to survive with release cycles that are 12 to 18 months in length.
They're really not, and now it's all about 1 week to 2 week sprints, and I mean customer delivery type code in those types of sprints. You have check-ins of code every single night, reviews of that code every single night, and then they become customer ready. And again, the advantages of cloud is the fact that, in a multi-tenant type environment, everyone gets the benefit all at once. But now the downside, right, or the drawback to that would be, let's say that I accidentally deliver something that has a vulnerability in it. So now think about like the scrambling that it takes to go ahead and fix that vulnerability, which is probably something we should talk about right now. So if I do deliver something out there and let's say that it does have a vulnerability in it, because we are releasing code so quickly in those chunks and doing those checks, the capability to fix something on the fly like that and turn around a mistake and patch it, I think is much quicker than like what you just said. Think about like if you go through an 18-month release cycle back in the 1920s when you graduated from school, and then all of a sudden you have to try to fix that 18 months worth of code. Forget it. Like that's nightmarish.
Right. Yep. I understand for sure. So let me.
Mark, did we lose your audio?
Sorry, I'm sorry about that. So Yeah, I think my apologies. So George,
No
Sumo
worries.
Logic is an early pioneer in running in the cloud. You know, seven years now. Grown from a small Silicon Valley startup in data analytics, you know, to a global, you know, machine learning data analytics provider running in the cloud with at massive scale. So what does that footprint look like that's powering your business?
Yeah, it's a massive footprint, you know. So, you know, this slide here, 1,300 plus customers. I mean, that's closer to 1,600. It's growing in leaps and bounds. You know, in the SaaS type world, it's all about logos. You want to bring people in and seed and feed, and in the SaaS industry, you can't afford to not get good customer service because it's subscription based. So that number needs to grow, and the churn needs to go down. So when you think about, you know, the scale that we have, it's also the scale of what you have to protect. You know, so when you were protecting against 200, 300 customers and protecting their data, that's one challenge. But now the challenge of quadrupling that number every single year, it's extremely difficult, and you have to have like a long-term view when it comes to scalability of security. You know, 10,000 plus instances, you know, it's a very elastic type environment. And this is where, you know, we didn't get to talk much about the audit on the last slide, but auditors really struggle with this. Like, well, what do you mean you only have like 8,000 servers today and you had 10,000 yesterday and you have 12 tomorrow? You know, it's the nature of cloud and virtualization in general. But if you look at, like, one of the things I'm the most proud of are these last two. If you look like at hundreds of petabytes processed and analyzed daily, that's insane. Okay, and that again is the value of being in the cloud, you know, because you have the capability to scale like that. If a customer is giving you 10 petabytes a day of data, and then all of a sudden you know they want to push that number to 20, which is massive, you got the capability to do it. You know, everything, the infrastructure is already laid out for you, and that elasticity is there. And then, you know, the 10,000 keys under management. I mean, that's
million.
Yep, 10 million keys under management. You're right. I mean, 10 million keys. I mean, that's huge, you know. And this is it's a very unique way that we actually do encryption, you know, leveraging tech. But it makes our customers feel very comfortable with the dual control type model that, you know, they have some ownership over the keys, and then we have the capability to vault these keys for them, and then do key encryption key on top of key encryption key for their keys, you know. So this is definitely security baked in from day one. When you know you're going to scale out to this size, and you're going to have this many instances running, processing this much data, and managing this many keys, that's pretty significant.
Right. I mean, that's a lot of keys. Now, I'm assuming some people might look at this number and say, "Wow, just why is it so big?" I mean, I'm assuming you're rotating keys daily. You're splitting up your data from your metadata to your raw data. You're encrypting each one. Those keys are rotated daily. They're going on this key ring. I mean, why is this number so large? And what technologies are you using to protect this data? Are you leveraging any AWS services like KMS or HSM or anything like that, or how do you, can you speak?
Yeah. We're not leveraging KMS, you know. It's something that we're looking at, you know. So KMS I think is very viable. You know, unfortunately, with the keys being stored in AWS and not allowed to be in a third-party vault, it makes it difficult when it comes to some of the audit community.
Right.
So they have to change their mindset a bit. But you kind of touched on it, you know. So we do rotate those keys every 24 hours, once for raw data, once for metadata. And then, you know, the customers end up with 730 different unique key rings on their keys at the end of the year, you know. So it's a very slick program, very manageable, very auditable that we use at Sumo Logic. But, you know, that number is kind of scary when people look at it from the outside. You know, so we do put it in a vault, and again, like that vault is encrypted with key encryption key. But I think that moving forward in the future, we can scale this, but we will start looking at things like KMS. Now, you brought up HSMs, which are, you know, also very, very interesting. But we, you know, here at Sumo Logic, and we believe in most cloud-based companies, everything's going to be software-based. So software-based vault, right, for sure.
Yep, I understand. So what tools and technology are you using in AWS? How do you kind of functionally group these tools, and how do you actually, you know, leverage these tools? What does the technology stack really look like?
Yeah, so the technology stack, so let's talk about AWS first, and I kind of touched on this in the beginning, you know. So elastic load balancers are at the heart of what we do, you know. So we set up those load balancers to make sure that, you know, nothing that's threatening gets through. So that's the idea, is that's our first layer of defense. And then we use security groups, and we configure those very much like firewalls to be able to route traffic to the right places and make sure that only users can access the right systems through the right ports and for the right services and processes. So we leverage a combination of those. But once you start really looking at what the service provider gives you, and again, I mean, you and I both know this, AWS, Azure, Google, they're ramping up their services every day, but there's still certain gaps of things that you need to do. VPC flow logs, we all know that's valuable, so source, destination, port, packet size, packet being dropped, all those things are great, but now what? Like, what is it I can really do on the host or within the environment to really get visibility? And visibility is something we haven't talked about enough yet, so we talked a little bit about it on the developer side, when you're baking security in and you're taking a look at what they're doing on a daily basis when they're checking in code, but it's also what's happening with the systems out there. So early on you had mentioned FIM, so we use file integrity monitoring. We happen to use OSEC for that across every single host, and then we centrally manage that. And that gives us extreme visibility into what files are being changed on those systems that are critical. So, and this is part of our evidence gathering, again, for compliance, so very separate but we couple these two worlds. And then also being able to leverage things like IDS and Snort and those signatures across those boxes to be able to detect any kind of signature-based attacks that are coming in or unwarranted type of changes to those hosts, and again, centrally manage it. And I'll stop here for a second because this is a point that I really want to make, is that everything that we do in the cloud is agentless or on the host. It's not your traditional inline type security. So earlier when you were talking about baked in versus on, that's a big difference. When you're baking security in, you have it on all your systems. You don't have it inline somewhere with choke points like spamming ports. That really just doesn't work anymore. And then we have, one of the things I really want to point out here, and again, we're not pushing one vendor over the other. This is just who we use. We're pretty much talking about capabilities, but we do have a great partnership with CrowdStrike. We had some internal things happen before, like everyone else has, where you get like a funky IP coming in through, VPC flow logs or a strange URL through Elastic Load Balancers. And, you can detect that it's a funky IP, but the amount of work for you to be able to do to understand what the threat level is, exactly what kind of threat it is, and who the bad actor may be is significant. So, we brought in CrowdStrike internally a while back, and we leveraged their Falcon Host solution to be able to identify those things. So is it a high-risk type threat? Is my confidence level high in it? Who is the bad actor behind it? Let me start taking timestamps of where, what, and when happened and create a post-mortem while I remediate. So it's one of those things where that functionality has been pretty critical to us. And then, obviously things like silence on the endpoint, that's valuable to us as well too. And this is another talking point, and you might have remembered this from San Francisco. People are still in the mindset because of PCI that I have to protect the endpoint with AV. And, no offense to our AV friends out there, but, but we just decided to take a step into the future a bit and start using a little bit more threat intelligence and dynamic checking on the endpoint instead of your traditional signature-based antivirus.
Definitely, absolutely. So how are you leveraging, Sumo Logic internally to secure your own service? I mean, can you share some of the tips, tricks, maybe some of the best practices that you've gleaned over the years in leveraging Sumo and Sumo?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a big thing, so Sumo Logic is at the epicenter of what we do from a security perspective. So we mentioned visibility before, and then leveraging apps like CloudTrail, now we're able to see exactly when an event takes place, who was the person behind that event, and then start looking for the impact of that event. So like in this case, when I'm starting to take a look at these dashboards, and these are Sumo dashboards, I'm constantly looking for authorization type things, so where am I having authorization type failures, or when are people making changes to network ACLs, and when is someone new being added to a security group, and does that person belong in that security group? So this is another interesting point because this is the world of security and compliance and the balance. When you think about security, I have to have the right people in these security groups to be able to perform the right actions and then protect that security group from having anyone else added to it that is an unauthorized user. Now, when it comes to compliance, I have to just gather evidence of who's in those security groups and show that I do the check. So the fact that I'm showing that I'm doing the check, it really doesn't mean that the auditor or the compliance person can say, wow, George Gerchow was just added to that security group. That's highly insecure. As we all know, that is a security violation right there in itself. I'm Panamanian. Yeah. But when it comes to security, we have to do our own checks and our own automation to make sure that the right people are added to those groups with the right credentials. And again, everything we do is least privilege. Yeah. So Sumo is definitely in the center of everything we do. We have applications built also for PCI and some other things as well too, VPC flow logs, but it gives us extreme visibility. And then, like before, you had like Evident.io and some other companies on there too. We actually have dashboards built that we use internally to be able to manage the logs and the data sources from all of these other applications. And it's extremely valuable once you start correlating patterns of behavior and unique forms of attack and looking across the environment just from a data analytics and logging perspective.
Right. So I would imagine as you start looking at, the vendors that you had on the previous slide in your technology stack, right, with some of these dashboards from Sumo that you're building, it's really, giving you kind of deep visibility into the AWS services, almost with a user-centric lens, right, where I can say, hey, I want to know, like, when is George coming into the environment? What changes is he making? What are the relationships of those changes? How does that change that you made impact, like, network traffic and latency in my environment? And then lastly, pulling in things like, AWS Inspector, which you support, as well as, apps like Evident.io, which are more around, vulnerability risk compliance. Like, how did that change that you made? How did that impact my, like, compliance and security posture? Really kind of connecting the dots between all of these different services to be more proactive in your security posture.
Yeah, I mean, that's really it. You want to be able to have the visibility, but then measure the level of impact whenever someone does make a change. But even then, more proactively, I just want to have visibility when something new has been added to the environment, or when something's been deleted from the environment as well too. And again, it fits a fine line between that security and compliance world, but natively in AWS, it's really hard to track these things. I mean, it's difficult. They don't kind of bring their worlds together. So they're looking for solutions, security analytics solutions like this, to kind of connect the dots and tie it all from one end to the other end.
Right. Awesome. Thank you. So you talked earlier about, the technology stack that you use and the different functional areas of how you view those technologies. How does that stack help you with compliance of the service? And also, as you're spinning up across thousands and thousands of EC2 instances that are up and down at any one given time, I mean, compliance got to be a real challenge.
It's a root canal. I like to describe it. It's a continual root canal, and it's one of those things where you got to be in this mindset of continuous compliance. And here's what I do love about compliance. So security people like to make fun of compliance all the time, which I think is the wrong thing to do. Because compliance actually, gives you the stick to get a lot of things done, and then people relate to it. So whether it's someone on the West Coast or someone on the East Coast, Europe, or even our good friends in Minnesota, they can all relate to compliance. So when you are of this mindset that you're constantly getting certified and getting the latest attestations and certifications in a dynamic environment, as you described in AWS, they realize that you're putting a lot of time, effort, and money into making sure that you're doing what you say you're going to do and protecting their data. So like right now we're going through, as you know, the last piece of evidence gathering, like literally one more piece of evidence for PCI 3.0. We're done. We'll be, what I believe, yay. I mean, it's a big thing. I believe we'll be the first SaaS-based provider sitting on AWS in a multi-tenant format to be 3.2, and it's no easy task, because you're right. As systems change, as these stateless systems spin up, being able to do evidence gathering and prove that you're protecting data in certain ways is difficult, and that's why it takes a combination of these. So obviously we know we're protecting cardholder data. ISO 27001 is, intimately, we just went through this again in CSA Star, which, by the way, we were one of the first companies on the planet to get CSA Star and renew it. And those two are interesting to me because they're easy to get, because you're saying, I'm going to go do X over the course of next year, hard to keep. Because if you don't do X and you do Y, you're going to lose those certs. And so, again, like a lot of times when, people come at us with these weird, bogus questionnaires, and yes, I'm saying that, I'm tired of them, look at what we do, right? I mean, look at the fact that we go through ISO 27001 and that we have to demonstrate what our policies are, how we adhere to these policies, what our procedures are around these policies, and then all the technical controls that come with things like CSA star. Now, same thing when we want to talk about, HIPAA and high tech. The fact that we go through those audits and that we're able to protect PHI and PII across all these different dynamic systems, EU Privacy Shield, which demonstrates data sovereignty, and it shows that we're able to segregate and separate data, and the fact that if someone wants to keep their data in Dublin, that yes, it'll span across multiple AWS data centers in Dublin, but it'll never leave that region. And again, that's kind of the power of cloud and data tagging and all these cool things that we do. Encryption, so encryption, here's where we fit into security with compliance, so encryption across the board, everything that we do, everything in the cloud is encrypted. And again, this is new, right? These are things that we really didn't do when we had that hard shell soft center. Before it was like anything coming in encrypted, anything leaving encrypted. No, just encrypt everything. So it gives people a level of confidence, or should give people a level of confidence, that we're doing the right things to protect our data and that we have the right checks in place and that there's actual evidence gathering going on.
Awesome, thank you. And so what about PCI compliance specifically? I mean, Sumo Logic has a number of, PCI apps. I mean, how are you leveraging those capabilities to help you with specifically PCI compliance, which is very prescriptive and some would say maybe even a little onerous?
It is. That's one of the things I like about it. There's like not a lot of gray area. I mean, granted, sometimes some of the writing can be ambiguous, and some of the perception from an auditor perspective can be ambiguous as far as the way they interpret it. But the thing I do like about it is like, hey, look, if this doesn't exist, if you're not following this control, remediate it right now. So what you're showing here is awesome. So these are apps that were built, at Sumo Logic internally to help us pass our own PCI audits, and we leverage these for evidence gathering nonstop. So who's successfully logging into different consoles, who's changing their passwords across CloudTrail, what kind of successful configuration changes or what kind of unsuccessful configuration changes that we had, how many times have people unsuccessfully logged into systems, which could also be an attack, right? So we were able to identify quite a few things, not only through the CloudTrail app, but through the Linux app as well too, that we built just to help us get through our certifications and attestations. And then while we were doing that, even though we're not a Windows shop, we realized that a lot of folks out there leverage Windows, so we built one for Windows as well around requirement 10. So these are just very focused. We call them little micro apps that we built internally to help give our team visibility and evidence gathering, like I mentioned before, and then now we're releasing those out to the general public here shortly.
Right. So in AWS's shared security model, I mean, all these attestations that you went through, I mean, this is on top of all the attestations that AWS provides, right? Because I've heard a lot, I see a lot of vendors try to live vicariously through the attestations that AWS provides and pass it on as efficient. This is all in addition to, right?
Yes, I mean, and that's a really, really good point, is that this is on top of AWS. So a lot of times what you'll see is you'll see these vendors like in a single tenant type environment, people trying to pass themselves, well, AWS has got FedRAMP or AWS has got, PCI or HIPAA, and it's like, well, wait a minute, you need to do your own security and your own attestations and your own controls on top of what AWS does to protect your data, because in a shared responsibility model, they only go so high up the stack, and we all know that, right? They go to the AMI. So it's all about that data, because ultimately the consumer is responsible for the applications and for the data. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. This is everything that we do all on our own, above and beyond anything that AWS does.
Yeah, awesome. So you talked a little bit earlier about, security and operational excellence, how you're trying to move security in more early to the development as they start, developing code, checking in code, what libraries they use. But can you talk a little bit, I want to dig into this a little bit, can you kind of talk about the operational and security best practices that Sumo Logic specifically employs to maintain, your scalable, highly secure, always on service, as well as any kind of like DevSecOps methodologies that are followed internally?
Yeah, and and it all comes really with setting out a strategy. Like part of the problem that I notice in a lot of organizations. I've been with some huge enterprises before, VMware, EMC. Lived in that family for a long time. I came from finance and from a government background. Is that there's not an overall strategy, and sometimes when there is, it's too siloed. So one of the things that we did was we took a look at what is it that we have to do as an organization. And so, securing our platform, well, that's critical to us. We've talked a lot about that today, so how we set up our ELBs or security groups, how we leverage, our CSP type offerings, and how code gets checked in and gets checked out. I mean, that's big. But at the same time, we have to continuously monitor that environment and all of our SaaS-based applications, right? Because when we use SaaS-based applications, across the board. And then how do we protect our endpoint and our end users? Because let me tell you, like right here, this is still the #1 threat, regardless whether you're on-prem or off-prem. It still comes down to end users, endpoints, passwords, password hygiene, and basic security hygiene. I mean, this is really all about traditional things that we've always known, defense in depth, concept of least privilege, but we're actually applying them from day one. And then compliance, we cannot forget about that. I mean, it fits tightly coupled into what it is that we're trying to do, so everything that we do from a security perspective has to have an output in the compliance world, and compliance helps drive a lot of things for security as far as, funding, for example. If you have to be compliant to something, well, that generates funding. That also helps security, because then now you can get some of the security tools you need to give you visibility and provide evidence. So it's an overall strategy that you have to start with and then start taking a deeper dive into each one of these different categories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Well said, George. I want to kind of pick up. You talked a little bit about, the authorized insider, the user, and we hear a lot about, threats coming from the authorized insider because they have a lot of access and a lot of, ability to get to the important data. But let's talk about external threats out there. Whether we're looking at cyber criminals, corporate spies, hacktivists, nation states, a whole bunch of threat, cyber criminals out there. How do you see the threat landscape changing with respect to the cloud? Is the risk greater given the massive scale of the surface that we're dealing with? Certainly we're seeing a lot more DDoS and ransomware attacks out there going against, cloud infrastructures. If someone hacked into an account within AWS or Azure, could they, cause more damage by pointing their attack at Amazon itself from within the service, possibly affecting, millions of customers? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so that's actually it's another good point, and not to put too much politics in it, but as we all know, someone's out there going, it's bad, very bad, everything's horrible, and there's a little bit of truth to that in some ways, in the fact that we're constantly under attack, and with the instability as to where our nation is today, we're going to see not only a lot more insider type attacks, but also external type attacks like you talked about. But in the very beginning, it all starts with password hygiene. Like literally almost every single cloud exploit that's taken place has been, or compromise that's taken place, has been because someone's using dictionary-based passwords. They're using it for their personal stuff, and then they use it for business type applications in the cloud. And this is no change. Yeah,
right. People want to sacrifice, security for convenience, right?
Exactly. That's a beautiful line, Mark, man. Like I like that line a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Sacrifice security for convenience. I mean, that's really compromise security for convenience is really what it's about, because they want things to be easy. But in the cloud world especially, it's a great time for us to start leveraging single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, so all these different things need to be involved. But at a minimum, end users should not use the same type of passwords. They should use heavily encrypted passwords, and they should not bring in their personal type application passwords into the business world. So I think if you just start using basic password hygiene from day one, even with something like Facebook, and turn on MFA, you're going to follow the best habits in the business world too. So separating those two worlds, that's not going to happen anymore. You're going to see people doing the same things all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, and it's not only just good password hygiene, but even like some of the recent attacks that we've seen where just people have gotten compromised servers because of like default credentials that were never changed. I mean, really, in today's day and age, it still happens. It's unbelievable.
It does, right? And it doesn't. Sometimes in cloud, if a company doesn't have security built in from day one or baked in or have that in their DNA, it's going to be about, hey, come use our service, come use our service, come use our service. Whoops. We forgot about something that we did, a while back, and now 17,000 boxes are compromised, I mean, it's just, and if you look at some of the people, even competitors in our space, that wasn't their mindset coming into it first, so And by the way, we help out a lot of these folks. We're always on Slack. We always help out a lot of folks who are in the cloud now, who are trying to kind of go, backtrack a bit and start changing their hygiene when it comes to some of these basic security principles. So
Yeah.
the second bullet is big too, and you mentioned this. The people who should be the most responsible are not. And a lot of times it's the demands of speed and work and everything else. And I look at admins and developers in this way, so all of a sudden you have a developer that puts their credentials into Slack, a full-blown Slack channel. And we've had things like that happen at Sumo Logic, and our chief architect is awesome. He's all over this sort of thing. And whenever someone does that, Mark, you know what we make them do?
Tell me.
We make them go back to every single place that those credentials may have been associated and rotate those credentials. And sometimes that can take, depending on work, it could take 2 or 3 days for them to do that. And it's not a matter of, we're not going to fire someone for making a mistake. It's a matter of that's the right thing to do because your credentials were just pretty much exposed, and it's going to show them, what could have happened and the level of effort, that it took to get to the point to where they were. And so it's going to show them to be responsible over what they just did, and then it's going to send a message to everyone else going, wow, I never want to have to do that. I better start making sure I don't do things like that. And I'm talking about even encrypted passwords in Slack. Because the minute that it's put into a channel like Slack or, Hep Chat or whatever it may be, it's now been made public. And then audit everything. We audit every last thing that we possibly can, and that's also part of baking it in. Our developers know we're looking at everything, and they're okay with it, right? Because they're following best practices. And like I said before, it's not that we're out to fire anyone for making a mistake. We will not do that. We will learn from our mistakes and get better.
So what are your thoughts? You talked about, putting credentials into source code and how you kind of deal with that. And, Bitcoin is getting a lot of kind of press out there, especially with ransomware where people are asking for payments. So what's your whole perspective on that? And we're seeing a lot more ransomware attacks going against cloud services. And what's your perspective and guidance there?
Yeah, and so let's talk about that for a second. That's a great lead-in, Mark. If you think about where we were 3 years ago, people weren't really attacking the cloud. Yeah, we had code spaces and all that, but people weren't really attacking cloud-based workloads that much because there weren't that many cloud-based workloads. Let's face it, Microsoft gets attacked because Microsoft is everywhere in the enterprise. VMware gets attacked because they're everywhere in the enterprise. However, now people are looking at AWS and they're looking at Azure and they're starting attacks, and one of the reasons why they're doing that is because the workloads are there and sensitive data is there, and plus you can use compute power to do some really cool things, from a attacker type perspective. So that's one of the reasons why you're starting to see that. I can tell you now that bug bounties alone, bug bounties across cloud-based companies are on the rise, where before you just didn't see that much of that, And that takes time and effort too, because you got to sort out what's real, what's not. Is this person really out here to help us out? Are they not? And then this one in particular, what you have here on this slide is Bitcoin mining. This has been around for a while, but it's more popular than ever. And most companies have been in the cloud have been hit by something like this. So what typically happens is you'll have a developer that'll upload a config file into GitHub, right? So open source, but then they'll have their AWS credentials inside of that config file. So then now you have a Bitcoin miner that goes out there, gets those AWS credentials, compromises that AWS instance of that developers, and then starts using the GPUs, right? So this is like the 3D graphical processing to be able to mine Bitcoins. Because when you first start mining Bitcoins, you could almost pretty much have done it from your laptop, assuming that you had great CPU power. Now it takes GPU power to really be able to mine Bitcoins and then get those into the ledger and get those things signed off. So you're seeing these instances all the time. And now, Mark, here's the other scary thing about it. One instance of this can cost an organization up to $8,000. So multiply that now. If you have an organization of 100, 200, 300, 400 people, if you start having a good percentage of those get compromised, you're now going to be helping someone else get rich while you pay the price on the back end. That can turn into a lot of money.
One of my old colleagues from a previous employer, they racked up $60,000 in costs because of a compromised account. Somebody who's spinning up instances and running stuff. I have a side question to ask you. So you talked about bug bounty and ransomware is certainly picking up. So do you pay it? How do you approach it? How do you validate it? Is this something that we should pay and they're going to do what they say, or are they just going to screw us anyway? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question, Mark, because what you have to do is you got to look at it from two different perspectives. But the first thing that we do whenever we see something like that come in is that we come back and say, you know what, thank you. So first of all, once we've identified that this is a real thing, and even if we haven't, our first approach is thank you. I mean, like, this will make us better.
Right.
If you found something that's legit out there, you just helped make us better. So we have to obviously get the vulnerability, review it, but if it's legit, we're gonna do something for those people. Now we're not in the business of being held to ransom or paying people off for things, but we do very cool things because we've had a friend of ours in Seattle that's helped us out before in the past, and some other people who've come up with some legit things, and we've done some things for them as well, and plus it's also always contracting type opportunities with a company when you do a bug bounty.
Right.
But the first thing is really thanks if you're trying to do the right thing, but then you got to inspect, because I can tell you now that 90% of the ones that we've gotten have been someone just out there trying to get some kind of Bitcoin payment up front, because that's what they want is Bitcoins, because they're not traceable. And most of the time we vet that out, and then we thank them for the time and move on our way.
Yeah, and I sort of alluded to this earlier when we talked about DDoS attacks. Like, what if somebody came in and did a DDoS attack and took out one of AWS's services? This is the size of the attack surface. I mean, it would take out tens of thousands of customers. I mean, what's your kind of perspective on the growth of this threat out there, and how organizations, and certainly how Amazon can kind of protect itself from preventing these things from happening?
Yeah, so I mean, look, we're obviously fans of Amazon, but here's where I don't agree with what a lot of Amazon says. So after this DIN attack took place, right, and again, this is domain name services in AWS, one of the many providers that do that. It shut down a good part of Amazon, and then of course, everyone in AWS was like, this is nothing, this will never happen. AWS Shield is out there, life is good. This is a major concern. I'm sorry, like, this is a big thing, and especially if you start thinking about sort of what you were alluding to, which I can have now Amazon attack Amazon and other people within Amazon and leverage all that kind of power. It'll be Amazon eating itself. So when you talk about things that, like, I think about and are top of mind moving into 2017 as far as security and where we're at, this is one of them. So this is a very big deal. And again, bad, very bad.
All right,
but it's happening, right?
Yeah, yeah. So when you look out toward, and we're kind of getting, to the end. I'm just looking at my time here. We're kind of getting to the end of the presentations. There's a couple of questions in the chat window. If you have any other questions for the people that are on, please add them. But when you look out towards the future, whether we're talking about, this whole DevSecOps movement, the phenomenal growth of cloud providers like AWS or Azure. I mean, I think AWS has surpassed $15 billion now. And this is what in half a dozen years. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, hearing a lot more about that as it relates to UBA, the rise of security as code. So what are your thoughts? Where do you see things going? How should companies kind of respond and deal with this from a people skill set? I mean, just what's your perspective about the future?
Well, I mean, I think the future is going to bring, a lot of change. I think, one, for the organizations who aren't moving out to the cloud, guess what? It's going to happen at one point or another. You're probably going to find yourself out of business. You're also going to find out two things. One, the cloud is pretty secure, and you can do a lot of things in a cloud-based security environment if you bake security in from day one, work with your developers. I got to talk about SREs too, so like our service reliability engineering team, those guys are a critical part of our security team. If you work together as a team, it can be very secure. However, on the other side of the coin, the future is also going to hold a lot more cloud attacks. Like we talked about AWS eating AWS. What about AWS eating Azure, or Azure eating AWS, or the emergence of Google? So I think you're going to see a lot more of that. And then kind of one of the things you said to me that's really interesting is user behavior analytics. I can't no longer go through this world of security and have hard-coded rules and certain things that I'm constantly looking for with all these false positives. That's just not going to work. It's not going to scale. I mean, look at the amount of data that we've been talking about on this call today. I have to be able to leverage machines to be able to consume that data and start surfacing up events that are very interesting and viable, for me to dig into and resolve in an automated threat response type fashion, which we're doing a lot of that. Like we didn't talk about change management. We do a lot of that with change management. We do a lot of this already right now when we find certain threats, and the future is just going to get more and more automated when it comes to those things, leveraging machine learning for sure.
Right.
And Internet of Things. That's one that scares me too. Internet of Things, man.
If I had to summarize what I just heard you say, so the world's getting more cloudy, more workloads moving to the cloud, teams are going to be coming closer together, security is going to become more baked into the whole process, looking at things from a user-centric lens. What are the users doing? What are they changing? How is that impacting things? Getting more context and out-of-the-box actionable information to move to more of a proactive posture and being able to accelerate the way you identify and respond to events. I mean, that's kind of like what I'm hearing. Is that accurate?
You nailed it. For being Canadian, you're dead on.
I apologize for that. So George, if we were kind of coming to the end here, if we had to kind of summarize, how would you summarize everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you keep it simple, so like people always think, oh, DevOps or DevSecOps or whatever the latest buzzword is, it's really all the same. As you're developing things, you want to make sure you have the right hygiene and basic security built into it, and you have visibility into that. And that allows you to scale as things get more complex. Where things actually become more complex is when you start adding more humans into it and you have less trust. But if you have that scalability and visibility from day one, in a simplistic approach, it's gonna do a lot of good for you. Yeah. And then we're always doing more with less, So, our team is small, but we leverage so many other people in the organization that are trusted advisors and trusted people as part of our security team that we inspect, that allows you to automate and be able to scale in a much more rapid fashion. And then ultimately, you need to have visibility. Again, you see visibility all over these slides because it allows you to make quick decisions. It allows you to automate the right things. And ultimately, it allows you to have the evidence that you need to be compliant to help people feel comfortable with the fact that you're protecting their data in the right way.
Awesome. That was a great summary. So for folks that are on the line, I mean, I encourage you to, come to our site to get more information on the way we help organizations build, run, and secure their modern new digital initiatives that they're running in the cloud. You can also sign up for a free trial of Sumo Logic, and the URL is provided here. But I want to move on to kind of like, we probably have about 5 or 10 minutes to kind of go through a couple of questions. And I see there's a number of questions here. So George, I'm just going to kind of throw it out at you. So how can CISOs talk to the board about, accelerating the business adoption of public cloud infrastructure? I mean, I know CISOs want to move workloads there, but sometimes there's concern, especially when you're looking at legacy financial and insurance companies. So what can CISOs, what can they do? What can they say? What words can they use in discussions with the board to help the business move faster to the cloud?
Yeah, it's kind of funny though, because you would think actually that most CISOs are thinking that way, but a lot of them aren't. It's really CIOs that are trying to drive a lot of this, and then CISOs are somewhat in the middle. But I think a CISO can have just about as much impact as anyone else in an organization at an executive level, even like a CFO. I think the main thing is that now you don't absolve yourself of responsibility, but think about the fact that earlier when we talked about the shared responsibility model, my team is no longer focusing on all the things that go with that part of the infrastructure, right? So all of setting up and configuring of all the network devices and all the AMIs and all the security that goes with that, we are now focusing on protecting the data and the application, which really allows the teams to really have a focused, simple point of view when it comes to what their mission is. I can now, if I'm in the business of airlines or healthcare or whatever it may be, I can now help that company mature that business and grow their customer base, because now I've like taken a few things off my plate that that weren't my core competency before. So I'm now focusing on the stewardship of my data and my applications, which I think is big. That's one message. The other is, that other slide that we had up, is it has to be an ecosystem. So now if you can break it down into how the company can generate more revenue, scale, deliver more features and products, and how security is not going to be a road bump, anymore, or a blocker, how we're going to be an enabler by building security in and baking it in from day one and getting that hygiene and that DNA across the company. I think that it's a very powerful message at an executive level and at a board level.
Yeah, here's some really good questions coming in. So with companies transitioning to the cloud, how have companies, ramped up just educating their workforce on, dealing with this new kind of world that we're in?
Yeah, that's been a tough one, because what I see most companies doing are going outside, because Internally, you have two things happening. You have people who are moving 900 miles an hour that are already there, get it, and they're going for it. But then you have the naysayers, and those naysayers can also influence people in the wrong way. So what I see a lot of organizations doing besides self-education is bringing in third parties, people like us, that talk about their story and talk about what we've done. And so sometimes it does take someone from the outside to come in and sort of talk about, some things that you and I talk about all the time, which is disruption. If you look at like all the companies out there, Netflix, Amazon, Uber, and all these different companies, Airbnb, for example, that have created like a whole new space, and just disrupted the space that they were in and continue to generate all this revenue and change the way that we live, it opens up a lot of people's eyes because at the end of all that is cloud computing.
Yeah, awesome. So here's another question. The Sumo Logic, how do you help, do you ingest and do you correlate information between these other sources, whether it's, CrowdStrike or Evidence.io and Snort? You have all these like technologies as part of the stack. How do you ingest and correlate that information? And as part of your analytics service, are those things that customers can run and benefit from?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a whole framework, which you're intimate with, Mark, of the things that we use internally, and we're able to ingest that data and correlate it and start looking across multiple data sources for patterns of behavior, but it takes an ecosystem. It's not just Sumo Logic alone. A lot of great partners out there. You just mentioned CrowdStrike and a few others that help us do this. So there's no silver bullet to security, but yes, we absolutely have that capability. And then things like outliers are built right into Sumo Logic, log reduce right into Sumo Logic that help you get to that needle in this haystack a lot faster than most traditional type logging solutions.
Right. And are there things an organization can do to help foster or accelerate this move to kind of DevSecOps, increasing the agility, the flexibility? People want to do this, but what can they do to help accelerate this move internally?
I think the biggest thing that you can do is start with your developers, So if you do two things, if one, you have security involved in the software development lifecycle, and then you get your developers security type training, like literally send them to DEF CON, send them to SANS, have them involved in all the security training you do, coding best practices. And yes, I understand you want their hands on the keyboard, but think about the cost and expense of, again, like I mentioned before, releasing code with vulnerabilities in it and how long it takes to straighten that out, So I think you start with the developer and the software development lifecycle. Like to me, sitting on a massive change review board, if it's something more agile like ours, that's different, but a massive change review board, it's probably wasting your time, But when you start sitting with the developers and you can see what the new digital initiatives are, what it is they're building, what way the organization's headed, and start instilling those best practices in them from day one and building that community with them, that's the best way to go.
Right. Awesome. So Carol, I think with that, I'm looking at the watch. I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. I want to thank everybody for joining. But Carol, I'll pass it back to you for closing comments.
All right. Well, thank you so much, George and Mark, for your great presentation, and to Sumo Logic for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, you can visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.